أخيا ورتل القرآن اصدح بصوتك اسمع الأكوان اقرأ كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان كالحجارة قسوة فإذا القرآن حين لانا كم من فؤاد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا إنك أنت الجواد الكريم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode in our series Reflections on the Quran. We're still talking about issues related to the sciences of the Quran and methodology of tafsir. In an earlier episode we mentioned that one of the areas of knowledge that we are particularly indebted to the Sahaba for are Asbaab Nuzool, the circumstances of revelation. Now, this term Asbaab Nuzool, composed of two words. Asbab is the plural of sabab. Sabab, linguistically, one of its meaning is a rope, and it's mentioned with that meaning in the Quran, where it's talking about a person attaching a sabab to the ceiling. What it means normally, however, is a cause. So how would that term cause be derived from a word which in its most physical meaning would be a rope? Well, a rope connects two things, and a world of cause and effect, this world we live in. So that causal link between this thing and its effect gave rise to the use of the term sabab. So it can also be thought of as a trigger that brings about certain effects. And the term nuzul, linguistically, it just means to descend. And from that, the Quran talks repeatedly about the sending down or the descending of revelation. So nuzul also means revelation. So Asbab Nuzul then are events that caused a verse to be revealed in order to clarify what the ruling would be for that incident. Also, not only incidents, but people would come to the Prophet ﷺ with a question, and as a response to that question, a verse would be revealed to answer their query. So these are the two main areas in which Asbab al-Nuzul operate: answering questions or providing judgment regarding an incident. Now, not all the verses of the Quran have some specific trigger event that led to the revelation. There's quite a few of them for which there are no recorded Asbab al-Nuzul. Now, it's mentioned that some of the Sahaba, like Abdullah bin Mas'ud, who was considered, one of the major experts on the Quran, he said that he knew the circumstances for which every verse was revealed. He knew when and where it was revealed and what circumstance it was revealed in. But the circumstance it was revealed in doesn't necessarily mean that it was revealed to address something that had just happened. And so Abdullah bin Mas'ud didn't see the need to explain, to transmit that particular knowledge of his to the rest of humanity. And if he did transmit it, it hasn't reached us, that's for sure. So it's more likely that he didn't focus on telling his students about that information for every verse, because it's not always relevant. But it can be relevant. We see some examples of narrations from the Sahaba where they describe an event and then a verse that was revealed to address what had just happened. Abdullah bin Umar, he recounted that when the leading hypocrite in Medina died, his son, who was actually a devoted Muslim, he came to the Prophet ﷺ and he asked the Prophet ﷺ to give him his shirt so that he could shroud his father in it. And then he asked the Prophet ﷺ to perform the funeral prayer for him. And the Prophet ﷺ agreed to do that. And Omar said, you know, this man was, for sure he was a hypocrite. How can you stand up to lead him in salat? And I mean, this gives an indication of how merciful he was and how concerned he was that nobody should go to hell. He said, all Allah did was give me a choice. And then he quoted the verse, استغفر لهم أو لا تستغفر لهم إن تستغفر لهم 70 مرة فلن يغفر الله لهم. Seek forgiveness for them or don't seek forgiveness for them. If you seek forgiveness for them 70 times, Allah will never forgive them. So the Prophet ﷺ did perform the salat for that man, whereupon the verse was revealed, وَلَا تُصَلِّ عَلَىٰ أَحَدٍ مِّنْهُمْ مَاتَ أَبَدًا وَلَا تَقُمْ عَلَىٰ قَبْرِهِ. Surah At-Tawbah. Never pray over any of them who has died, and do not stand at his grave. So this particular narration was collected by both Al-Bukhari and Muslim, and it's very authentic and it's very explicit in linking the incident with the revelation of the verse. Now, what's the benefit of knowing this information? One angle of benefit is that it gives us greater insight into the wisdom behind the law. And knowing that, I mean, it's just natural for people to have greater serenity when they understand why they're being asked to do something. So understanding the reasons for legislation then increases people's willingness to comply. And also, a fair-minded non-Muslim, if they were aware of this kind of knowledge, they would have a further appreciation for the appropriateness of Islamic law to people's lives. There was a verse that was revealed in Surah An-Nisa, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى حتى تعلموا ما تقولون. O you who believe, do not approach prayer when you are drunk until you know what you're saying. And the cause for the revelation of that verse mentions that the Muslims, for the first at least 13 years or so, maybe 14 years of the mission of the Prophet ﷺ, nothing was said about prohibiting the drinking of wine. So some people got together for a dinner party and their host served them wine, and then it was time to pray Isha, and they prayed there in the house, and the host led them in prayer, and he was drunk, and he recited Surah Al-Kafirun, and instead of reciting, O you who disbelieve, I do not worship what you worship, he left out the word not. So he recited, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ أَعْبُدُ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ. O you disbelieve, I worship what you worship. So of course, I mean, that's a gross error that came about as a result of being drunk. So the verse was revealed after that incident. Another thing that we get from this knowledge is an appreciation of Allah's concern for His sincere worshippers. So the incident of Aisha, when she lost her necklace and she was left behind, and she had gone off in the desert, it was nighttime, to look for it, and when the people put her hawdaj as this covered kind of a seat that was placed on a camel, and she was quite light, and the nature of these contraptions is that they were made out of fairly heavy wood. So the people who lifted her covered seat onto the camel, they didn't realize that she wasn't on it. So the army headed off, and she wasn't with them. I will take a break and come back. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, welcome back. So in this incident of Aisha, where she got left behind and the army broke camp and went ahead, and then there was a Sahabi who had also, for some reason, he had been behind, and he came to the camp and he saw Aisha there, and he put her on his camel, and he walked and he led her until they caught up with the army. So the chief of the hypocrites began spreading the slander that, you know, a young man and a young woman, they're alone together. Well, what was going on? It became like a serious issue, and the Prophet ﷺ wasn't sure, you know, well, what did go on? And this state of affairs continued for days, stretching into weeks, but eventually Allah revealed verses exonerating Aisha. So one of the things that we can get from that incident and Allah's revelation of Quran to protect her reputation was a sense of Allah's concern for the well-being of those who are His sincere worshippers. Another thing that knowledge of this issue can do is to guard against misinterpretation. A famous example of that is in Surah Al-Baqarah. Allah says, وَأَنفِقُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَلَا تُلْقُوا بِأَيْدِيكُمْ إِلَى التَّهْلُكَةِ. Spend your wealth for the cause of Allah and be not cast by your own hands to ruin. There's a famous incident where at one of the battles after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, a man just charged into the enemy ranks until he was completely surrounded by the enemy, and he was fighting like a whirlwind. And when he did that, somebody shouted out this verse, "Don't be cast by your own hands into ruin." And after the battle, one of the Sahaba, he said, whoever recited that verse was misinterpreting it. He said, this verse was revealed about us, the Ansar, after we had made all these sacrifices for the defense of Islam, and people began entering Islam into large numbers. Then we began saying to each other, well, we've done our share. Let somebody else now take over the burdens of spreading this message. So he said, Allah revealed that verse to warn us that if you just stop at this point, that will be a cause of your self-destruction. You have to keep striving in the path of Allah. So that's another aspect of the benefit of this knowledge. There's also an incident mentioned about Abdurrahman bin Abi Bakr. Now, he accepted Islam relatively late. Abu Bakr, his father, the great companion, the Khalifa, he had accepted Islam almost immediately. And his son remained behind when the Muslims made hijrah. He stayed in Mecca, and he ended up fighting in the Battle of Badr on the side of the mushriks, the idolaters. So he accepted Islam later. And at a certain point after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, there was a governor in Medina who was doing certain things that Abu Bakr spoke out against. So this governor, he wanted to neutralize the political threat posed by these criticisms, and so he began circulating this opinion that a verse that was revealed in one of the Hamim surahs, I'll just read the translation. Whoever says to his parents, "Fie upon you both, do you threaten me that I will be brought forth again when generations before me have passed away?" And they both cry to Allah for help and say, "Woe to you, believe, indeed the promise of Allah is true." But he says, this is nothing but fables of the men of old. So Marwan said, this verse was revealed about Abdurrahman ibn Abu Bakr. So basically what he was saying is that the nerve of this guy, you know, the Quran criticized him, you know, for being slow to accept Islam. And the Quran criticized him, and so he must be a bad man, and therefore don't listen to him. And when Aisha heard about that, she said, it wasn't revealed about him. I know who it was revealed about. And she said, if I chose to, I could say. She chose not to, probably because that person was still alive and was now a Muslim, and she didn't want to subject him to embarrassment. So how do we know that something is a sabab nuzul? As we've said earlier, it really requires a statement of a sahabi. If it was a statement by somebody after, then that by itself is automatically weak. Now there is a principle in hadith science that if a tabi'i, the generation after the sahaba, if a tabi'i attributes something to the Prophet ﷺ, or in this case, knowledge that he couldn't have had direct access to, that yes, that is by itself a weak narration, it's a weak statement. However, if there's two tabi'is and they both saying the same thing, then conceivably this statement and this statement corroborate each other, so the likelihood of it being an accurate statement goes up. Now, Imam Shafi'i mentioned that, in order to be sure about that, you need to know that these two tabi'is weren't taking knowledge from the same people, because if they were, then there's a very likely possibility that both of them have the same intermediate teacher, in which case the problem hasn't gone away, it's still there. So if they were known to have different teachers and they're both saying the same thing about a circumstance of revelation, then there's some kind of strengthened possibility about the authenticity of their statement. Now, even if you have that, there could be other considerations for saying, wait a minute, this is still fairly shaky evidence, and this explanation here is conflicting with some stuff that are known in the religion, or if there are internal inconsistencies in a given narration, and especially the different variants of it, then that would also discount the likelihood that we can put weight on this explanation. Inshallah, we'll, in the next episode, talk in some detail about a case like that. Now, sometimes Asbaab Nuzool are weak, and scholars of tafsir have just passed them along without really rigorously checking out the chain of narration, and that ends up actually causing slander of certain people. There's a passage in Surah At-Tawbah which says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ومنهم من عاهد الله لئن آتانا من فضله لنصدقن ولنكونن من الصالحين فلما آتاهم من فضله بخلوا به وتولوا وهم معرضون فأعقبهم نفاقا في قلوبهم إلى يوم يلقونه بما أخلفوا الله ما وعدوه وبما كانوا يكذبون. And among them are those who made a covenant with Allah, saying, if He should give us from His bounty, we will surely spend in charity, and we will surely be among the righteous. But when He gave them from His bounty, they were stingy with it and turned away, and they refused. So He penalized them with hypocrisy in their hearts until the day they will meet Him, because they failed to fulfill their promise to Allah, because they broke their promise to Allah, and because they habitually used to lie. Now, some of the books of tafsir have transmitted some narration which pinpointed a particular sahabi and said, this verse was revealed about him. And first of all, the isnad of that narration is weak. And moreover, that particular sahabi, he participated in the Battle of Badr. And the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned that every Muslim who participated in the Battle of Badr, that they will not go to hell. So we have the testimony of the Prophet ﷺ on behalf of that sahabi, that he was a true believer. He wasn't a hypocrite. So it was unbefitting on the part of those scholars of tafsir to transmit a report like that. Now, there are certain ways that the Sahabi would express whether something was a circumstance, a trigger event for revelation. Sometimes he would say, the sabab al-nuzul for this verse was such and such. And that's a pretty explicit way of making the link. Or he'll say, this thing happened and then this verse was revealed. And that's also explicit. Sometimes, though, they would say, this verse was revealed about such and such, or it covers such and such. And they give a particular, like, Sahabi or an incident that verse would apply to. In that case, it's not at all explicit, it's implicit. What that statement could also mean is that this verse would cover that situation. Not necessarily that situation was the cause for the revelation of the verse. So sometimes you have multiple narrations about what was the cause for the revelation of a verse. And first of all, you look at the isnad. What's the most authentic isnad? And then you also look at, well, what is there a phrasing here where it's explicitly linking the incident with the revelation of the verse, or is it something where it could be interpreted in some other way? So these are some key issues related to sorting out what is the most authentic narration about sabab nuzul. Come to the end of this episode. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allahu a'lam.
اقرأ أخيا ورتل القرآن اصبح بصوتك اسمع الأكوان اقرأ كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان كالحجارة قسوة فإن